What is your favorite song? Listen to it now in your head. Don't rush it. Let the first notes fade in softly, like they're drifting through a distant room. Let it come alive in your thoughts. Hear the texture of the voice, the rise of the melody, the quiet spaces between the sounds. How does it make you feel? Warm, achy, hopeful, nostalgic? Dwell on it, sit with it. Do you think of it often on long drives, late nights, quiet mornings, when the world feels too heavy or strangely beautiful? Let it expand in your memory. Remember where you first heard it, who you were then, who you were with, the version of yourself that existed in that moment. Do you know all the lyrics, the tiny inflections, the breaths between the lines? Can you anticipate every beat before it lands? Do you know a lot about the artist, their story, their struggles, what they were trying to say when they wrote it? Or does the song feel like it belongs more to you now than to them? If a song can take so much of your time, memory, and attention, what about other things? Today we're expanding on that sensation, that all-encompassing feeling to something darker, the pervasiveness of sin. Scott Layton here. Welcome to the Renaissance Spirit. I'm not speaking from a place above this. I'm talking about the things I still have to starve in myself. We began this journey with a question. What does it mean to transcend? In episode 2, we explored how different traditions wrestle with that question. In episode 3, we landed on a simple, radical truth. Transcendence begins with a choice. But today we ask, what keeps us from making that choice? What keeps us orbiting the same patterns again and again? And that brings us to a difficult word, sin. Let's start with what sin is, then we'll discuss why it's keeping you from the path. Sin, it's a word that can feel heavy, sometimes shaming, sometimes misunderstood, but at its core in the Catholic tradition, sin is not just breaking a rule. It's a rupture in our relationship with God, with others, and even with our true selves. Catholicism teaches that sin is both personal and cosmic. There's original sin, that inherited fracture from the very beginning. And then there are personal sins, our freely chosen actions that wound love, distort truth, and damage communion. Grave sin, or mortal sin, severs us from grace. Venial sin weakens us, but doesn't destroy that bond. But either way, sin isn't just bad behavior. It's disorientation. It's turning away from the source of life and light, from the good we were made for. In the Catholic tradition, grace, especially through the sacraments, isn't just pardon for sin, it's strength to resist it. Reconciliation isn't shame, it's repair. But here's where it gets interesting. This idea isn't unique to Catholicism. In Judaism, sin is seen more as missing the mark, chet. It's an act of turning off the path, of violating a divine command, but it's also deeply relational. The high holy days are filled with rituals not only to ask God's forgiveness, but to make amends with people you've hurt. Because sin isn't just between you and God, it's social. In Islam, sin is an act that goes against the will of Allah, but there's no doctrine of original sin. Each soul is born pure. What matters is choice, intention, and sincere repentance. Tawbah. One of the most repeated phrases in the Quran is that God is most merciful. In Hinduism, sin, papa, is less about divine offense and more about spiritual imbalance. It binds the soul to suffering and the cycle of rebirth. Good actions, punya, purify. Sinful ones cloud the soul. Liberation, moksha, comes through purification of mind, of conduct, of understanding. Buddhism doesn't focus on sin in the same way. There's no lawgiver God to disobey, but there is suffering, and suffering often stems from ignorance and attachment. Unskillful actions like greed, hatred, delusion produce negative karma, and karma is real. It shapes our future experiences. So, while the language may differ, the insight is similar. Our actions matter. In Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, sin is anything that distances you from divine love. It's not just breaking rules, it's spiritual forgetfulness, forgetting who you are, forgetting your origin and your destination. And in many indigenous traditions, sin isn't a courtroom verdict. It's imbalance, disharmony, a violation of the natural or ancestral order. Restoration, not punishment, is the goal, often through ritual, community, and returning to right relationship. Even secular thinkers recognize something close to sin. They speak of injustice, of ethical failure, of the way we rationalize harm. The language is psychological, not theological, but the longing for integrity remains. If the word sin doesn't speak to you, think of it as misalignment, as anything that pulls you away from your highest self or purpose. So what is sin? It's the name we give to our failure to love rightly, to know what is good and choose something else, to turn inward, selfishly or fearfully, when we were meant to live outward toward God, toward others, toward truth. We can argue about doctrine, we can debate about destiny, but all of us, across religions and philosophies, wrestle with the same human burden. We know we are not yet what we ought to be, and we are, in different ways, trying to return. As we illustrated with the introduction analogy of your favorite song, sin is pervasive in our thoughts if we let them in. Sure, we all have triggers, actions, and reactions, like we discussed with the habit loops in episode 1, but like we talked in episode 3, choice carries us forward to enlightenment, and choice first keeps us from being weighed down by sin or engulfed in it. Like sin keeps us away from God, sin keeps us from our path forward. It is said that there was only one person who was free from the blemish of sin. We all carry it like a yoke around our shoulders, and with that weight carrying us down, it becomes difficult to carry that weight as we walk the path of righteousness to transcendence. When we live a life of sin, there's little room in our thoughts, in our hearts, and in our soul for anything else. Sure, you can seek forgiveness, contemplate your mistakes, meditate, but until you free yourself from the pervasive power of sin, you're never quite free from its clutches, never quite free from its grasp. We all have triggers, but do you go out of your way to seek them? Do you dwell on them? How much of time and attention do you give it? As I sit here, chilly once again in the courtyard of my Airbnb in Corsi, typing away on my keyboard this script, something becomes clear to me. I first had the feeling last night. Maybe the journey to ascension and transcendence can be described as path up a pyramid, like that of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but instead of stages, it's steps up the pyramid to the elusive goal of enlightenment. Not that the true path can be boiled down to a two-dimensional diagram like that. It has nuance and seasons, and every step is related and interacts with others, as we'll continue to discuss in this and future episodes. Avoidance of sin is a choice, so those two steps or stages interact with each other as they do with the others, encircling like planets circling the sun, each with a perceptible pull on the other. Sin, too, has a pull, and until we release it from our orbit, we're bound by it, bound to it. And the pull can be too strong to continue our journey, so we must break free, to choose to release ourselves from its destructiveness. Only then will we have the room in our hearts and minds and souls for our continued journey. So how do we free ourselves from the pull of sin? Here is a simple truth that may not always be self-evident, one that I, as well as any of us, may struggle to accept. The more we give in to sin, the easier it is to give in to sin the next time. Just like an addiction or a habit, or anything for that matter, the more time, attention, and energy we give to sin, the more power it has over us. To try to break free, we must suffocate it like fire without air. Because sin, whatever word you prefer for it, vice, compulsion, ego, selfishness, destructive behavior, doesn't survive on strength. It survives on repetition, on attention, on unconsciousness. Every time we seek it, indulge it, justify it, or say, just this once, we lay another thread, and enough threads become rope. Enough rope becomes a leash, and eventually we call the leash just who I am. But most destructive behaviors aren't defeated head-on. They starve. A fire dies, not because you fight every flame, but because you remove the oxygen. So the question isn't, how do I overpower this part of me? It's, how do I stop feeding it? That means interrupting the loop. Not putting yourself in situations where temptation is easy. Not rehearsing the same thoughts that justify the behavior. Not romanticizing the very thing you're trying to escape. Choosing, in other words, to free ourselves from the pervasiveness of sin. It means replacing, not just resisting, because nature hates a vacuum. If you remove a habit and don't fill the space with something better, connection, purpose, movement, prayer, meditation, service, creativity, the old pattern just creeps back in. This is why every spiritual tradition talks about both renunciation and cultivation. Not just don't sin, but do good, not just avoid darkness. Not only walk toward light, but let that inner light guide your path to enlightenment. Because transformation isn't subtraction alone, it's replacement. You don't become free by clenching your fists harder. You become free by loosening your grip and choosing something higher over and over until the old path grows faint from disuse, until what once felt irresistible simply feels irrelevant, and that's the quiet miracle. Sin doesn't always leave in a dramatic battle. Sometimes it just starves and disappears because you stopped feeding it. Tonight before bed, ask yourself, what one thing am I feeding that's slowly feeding on me? In our next episode, we'll discuss discernment and contemplation and how it relates to sin and choice to better root out how and why we use sin in our daily lives to help us more fully escape and suffocate sin from our lives. In the meantime, ask yourself this: is sin pervasive in your life? And are you ready to let your inner light guide you on your own path to enlightenment? Let us know in the comments below, and until next time, keep this simple question in your mind. Does your action help or hurt your life and your path forward? Thank you for taking this journey with me, and always remember, you're not alone.